Hello everybody, I'm Iain and in this video I want to talk about the hierarchy of correction when it comes to instructing martial arts and self-protection. As martial arts instructors, self-protection instructors, when we're watching our students do given drills and exercises, we're going to see numerous things that can be improved upon. Nobody does anything perfect, right? When we're going to give feedback to the student, it's no good if we just give them a big long list, right? That's inefficient for them. It's not good for us either. What we need to do is give them 1, 2, at most 3 things that can improve upon. So the student, instead of having this big, long, unfocused list, they know where to focus their efforts. They know the things that you want them improving. Now, to me, it should seem obvious that the things we want them to focus on are the things that are going to lead to the greatest improvement in performance. So if there's some minor technical thing that even if it was right is only going to lead to a minor improvement in performance, we shouldn't be talking about those things if there's major improvements to be made elsewhere. So the way that I structure this is I have a 4-tier hierarchy. So when I'm looking at the students, the first thing I'm going to analyze is mindset, because that's the most important thing. If the mindset's okay, I'm going to start looking for strategic things. If the strategy's okay, then I'm going to look for tactical things. And if the tactical things are okay, then I'm going to start looking for and feeding back technical things. Now, obviously, in each of those categories, there's a further hierarchy within each. So sometimes there's numerous technical errors. The one that will make the biggest improvement is the one obviously you should focus in on. But in broad terms, these are the kind of 4 categories I'm going to use. I'm going to look at mindset, because that's more important than strategy, which is more important than tactics, which is more important than technique. So I'd now like to break each of those down in turn. So there should be no doubt that mindset is the most important thing. If mindset is not in place, everything else goes with it. If you have a guy who is aggressive, determined, focused, they're instantly dangerous, irrespective of their strategic, tactical or technical abilities, right? It's the most important thing. Now, obviously, there's masses to mindset. You can't cover it all in a short little video such as this. The point I'm trying to make is it's the most important thing. And therefore, if there's obvious deficiencies in it, correcting those deficiencies will lead to a greater improvement in performance than anything else. So we'll just talk about some general points. So the first thing is that in any combative style scenario, adrenaline will be flowing. There will be a degree of fear, if you want to label it as that, or anxiety flowing through the system. That's there. It's there for everybody. It's like, the old saying, heroes and cowards feel the same thing. They just deal with it differently. Everybody feels it. It is how you deal with it. So if the student is feeling that and then they're focusing in on that to the point where they're becoming nervous, jumpy, it's eroding the confidence, that's obviously going to have a massive impact in performance. If you can educate them, look, those feelings are normal and natural, and actually they're quite useful. That butterflies in your stomach, great. That's your body shutting down the digestive system and putting it into the muscles. That shaking, great. That's the muscles getting ready for action. That increased heart rate, great. That's the heart feeding more fuel to the muscles. All of this, although it doesn't feel great, all of it will actually lead to improvements in performance. So a nice demarcation you can use is to get the students to understand the difference between cognitive anxiety and somatic anxiety. So cognitive anxiety is what they feel in their head, whereas somatic is what they feel in the body, if you like, in those broad terms. So they need to get to the point where when they feel that adrenaline rising, if they feel, oh man, I'm scared, oh, I wish I wasn't doing this, man, I'm really scared. If that thought pattern happens, the mindset's going to erode real quick. Right? Whereas, if you can get to the point where they feel the adrenaline, the same thing's happening in the body, but in their mind they go, whew, here it is, great, that's the rocket fuel I need for optimum performance, you're going to get a much different result there. You're going to get a much stronger performance. So that can be really useful, right? We're looking for that. Are they allowing the somatic anxiety to affect the way that they're dealing with it cognitively within their mind? Can we help with that? One thing that can really help with those feelings is aggression. Now, aggression isn't anger. They're two very different things, so we need to watch for that too. If the student is using like anger is like it's a wildfire, it's unfocused, it's really problematic. If they're getting angry, that's something else we need to work on. We need to channel them towards aggression. Aggression is like a laser beam. It's focused, and once that aggression kicks in, right, that tends to be able to turn those feelings of fear into that rocket fuel. It moves that adrenaline in the right way. That combination of adrenaline and aggression is incredibly potent. Again, aggression not to be confused with anger. Aggression is something you are in control of, whereas anger is something that is in control of you. Okay. You may use different terminology, but this is the way that I use it, right? So you have that laser-focused aggression. And that's the other thing, okay? Focus. What we don't want is the student's mind flipping all over the place. We want them focused on the task at hand. So if they're getting distracted by how they're feeling, whether they're tired, whether they're fatigued, how the cognitive things, that is a problem, we want them solely focused on the task at hand. So we need to make sure that they're dealing with the adrenaline correctly, we need to make sure the aggression is in place, and we need to make sure they're focused. If you've got those three things, you're going to get, pretty much a very strong performance out of them. If any of those is deficient, you should put your effort in correcting those before you look at anything else in the hierarchy that we're now going to move on to discuss. So the mindset will definitely have more influence on performance than anything else. So we want to correct that first. That's the thing that's going to give us the biggest bang for the buck. If the mindset's looking pretty solid, then what we now look at is strategic issues. And the strategy is how they are looking to achieve the goal. Now, obviously, to do that, we need to define the goal. So we define the goal. The strategy is how we intend to achieve the goal. The tactics are how we will enact the strategy, and the tactics will determine the choice of technique. So again, there's a hierarchy there as well. So having defined the goal, and even there, generally speaking, martial artists aren't always great at doing this. I've talked about this a lot in other videos, but I think the failure to understand that differing scenarios has differing goals is widespread throughout the martial arts. They look at, well, that worked to outfight another martial artist in this context, therefore it's ideal for all other contexts. And obviously that's not the case. As the goal changes, everything else changes with it. If we're talking about, we'll use self-protection as an example, the aim of self-protection, the goal of self-protection is to avoid harm, both physically and legally. So let's say we're doing a drill where the student are practicing escaping from multiple enemies, right? So faced by more than one people, how do we escape from here? And then let's say that the student seeks to outfight them. Okay, takes the fight to them instead of looking to escape. At that point you go, right, okay, there's a strategic error here, right? You're not trying to outfight three people is not the most efficient way to achieve the goal of avoiding harm. It's unlikely to work, irrespective of how well you actually do when you're fighting. Right? What you're far better doing is going, right, the best way to achieve this goal in this scenario is to escape from them. So is that what they're trying to do? Are they trying to achieve the goal in the most efficient way, right, with sound strategy? Now, obviously, that works for all the various forms of consensual violence as well. Non-consensual violence being self-protection, consensual violence when we spar each other. Lots of different ways to do that. Boxing matches, judo matches, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, MMA, points karate, lots of different ways. So however you're fighting, you go, this is the goal. What is the best way to achieve that goal? And they're the strategic things. If the student is veering away from that, you need to correct that before you start talking about any tactical things or technical things. So that's the next thing on the hierarchy. Mindset first, then we start looking at strategy. Is the student looking to achieve the goal in the most efficient way? So as we just mentioned, the goal will determine the strategy will determine the tactics, and the tactics will determine the choice of technique. There's that hierarchy too, right? When we're looking at the student's performance, is the mindset correct? If it is, great, then we look at strategic things. Is the student looking to achieve the goal in the most efficient way? And then we start looking at tactical things. Now, in everyday speech, people often use the word strategy and tactics interchangeably, and that can cause confusion. But the strategy is the higher level stuff, right? The tactics are a layer of detail down. So if we were talking, the goal of self-protection is to avoid harm. If the situation we're in involves multiple enemies, then the strategy is going to be to escape from them. And the tactics are going to be, well, how do we do that escaping? So the tactics will be things like, how do I position myself to make myself least vulnerable? So how do I make sure I've got avenues of escape? How do I make sure no one gets behind me? You know, these kind of things, they're tactical considerations. Drawing the attention of other people, trying to remove the group's motivation. How I would do those things are tactical. Now, how I enact the tactics will be with the technique. But to give an example, right, you know, let's say I'm trying to escape this group and I reach out and grab one of them and go bump and headbutt him. Let's say it's a superb headbutt. No problem with the technique. But tactically, that would be an error because my strategy is to escape the group. And to remove distance, to get closer and to establish a grip is a tactical mistake. Because the tactics of ensuring I can escape should be that I'm creating space, not removing space. So that's the layer down, right? So we look first at the mindset, then we look at the strategy, and then we look at the tactics. Now, if the tactics are all okay, and there's no great errors there, then we start looking at the technique. Because again, you know, if they just using the headbutt, they can get the technique perfectly performed. But if it's tactically not congruent, that will lead to problems. That won't lead to the result that we want. So it needs to be mindset first, strategy second, tactics third. The tactics will determine which techniques are appropriate. So we're using the right techniques in order to achieve the goal that we want. We can then start looking at the quality of the technique itself. So hopefully it goes without saying that a high level of technique, you know, really good quality technique is something that all martial arts should be pursuing. So I'm not in any way downplaying the importance of technique. I've been training the martial arts since I was a kid. I've spent decades trying to improve my techniques. Techniques I was shown on my first ever martial arts class. I'm still working to improve now. I'm working decades, hour after hour after hour, for minor improvements. So my technique is as sharp and precise as it can possibly be. So a high level of technique is something I want. When it comes to performance though, we need to acknowledge that high quality technique alone isn't going to achieve much if it's divorced from the mindset, the strategy, and the tactics. Now, we sometimes see that in martial arts where people are basically doing the technique for the technique's sake. You know, it's less martial and more art, and that's fine if that's your thing. If you're doing it for the aesthetics of it and the art of it, that's great. But you need to be honest with yourself and acknowledge that that isn't going to deliver any functional result. If you haven't discussed things like mindset, you haven't discussed things like strategy and tactics, they are more significant to the outcome than technique is, although technique obviously remains very important. Now, of course, when you're watching the students train, we train in different ways. So let's say you have got the student just solely working on technique. You've got them doing kion or kata or something like that. Well, obviously, in those scenarios, although mindset, you hope, would still be part of the technique, you're still primarily looking at the quality of the technique. But when it comes to real-world application, then we can see all four elements in play. Is the mindset there, the strategy there, the tactics there, and the quality of the technique there. As soon as we start talking about real-world performance, all four of them matter, right? Of course, there are forms of training where we're going to focus in on different ones. But in terms of performance, all four matter. And if you're seeking performance, all four of them need to be there. As an instructor, when you're analysing performance, we should acknowledge that mindset will have a greater result on performance than strategy. Strategy will have a greater result on performance than tactics. And tactics will determine the choice of technique. And tactics will have a greater influence on the performance than the quality of the technique. Okay, so that's generally the hierarchy. If the mindset's in place, then I'm going to start looking at the strategy. If the strategy's in place, I'm going to look at the tactics. If the tactics are generally sound, then I'm going to start looking at technical things. And as we discussed earlier, when you come to the technique, obviously even within them, there's hierarchies within it, right? So there might be several things wrong with the technique. I think you focus in on the thing that will lead to the greatest improvement in performance for the student, okay? And then you can whittle that away over time, so we get down to finer and finer things as the level of performance gets higher and higher. So one very important thing I'd like to make sure that everyone understands is that we are talking about a hierarchy of correction here, not a hierarchy of instruction. So as we've talked about in performance, all four of those things will be integrated, and they will be integrated in instruction in the first instance. So when I'm teaching my students, I will be talking about the mindset, the strategy, the tactics, and the techniques as an integrated whole, because that's how they're going to apply it, right? You can't teach mindset alone. You just can't, because they need to be physically doing something in order, to trigger that adrenaline and everything else. So you need them physically doing something, and you can't teach strategy and tactics without the technique to put those strategy and tactics into practice, right? Otherwise, they're just ethereal concepts, right? So together, all of them come together. So I'm not talking about an order of instruction. I don't spend a month teaching them mindset, and then we'll talk about strategy, then we'll talk about tactics, and then we'll talk about technique. All four of them come together in instruction. But when I'm watching the student perform, it's what I'm going to emphasize on the feedback to them. Because again, based on what is likely to lead to the greatest improvement in performance. So when we're teaching, when we're instructing in the first instance, all four of those things will be integrated. When they're performing, again, all four of those things will be integrated. But in terms of what I am going to emphasize in my feedback, I am going to emphasize mindset over strategy, over tactics, over technique when it comes to performance-based drills. All of them are important. If you want the optimum performance, you need all of them in place. But there's no point me talking about hip rotation of a strike, for example, in the middle of a live drill if the student's mind is all over the place, or they're consumed by fear or consumed by anger, because that hip rotation isn't going to counteract that. I need to get the mindset correct first. Right, and same again, if they're strategically all over the place or they're not effectively pursuing the strategy through bad tactics, no technical thing will be able to correct for that. All right, so I need those things in place, and then I'll work on those other things. And of course, I'm not saying when you're giving feedback, ignore technique until everything else is perfect. Of course, you don't do that. I'm just saying, what do you emphasize the most in your feedback? So, if there's a big problem in mindset, that's where you want to put your emphasis. If mindset could be improved a little, mention that, and then maybe talk about some strategic things, some tactical things, and some technical things as well. But for me, the student wants 1, 2, at most 3 things for them to work on. Otherwise, it just becomes impossible, right? Be focused in your feedback so the student can be focused in their training as they try and integrate that feedback into their training. And again, to me, it just makes sense to emphasize the things that will have the greatest impact on performance, okay? So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you found it useful. Of course, other correctional models exist, but nevertheless, I hope you found mine interesting. Thank you for watching this video to the end, and I'll be back with more soon, okay? Take care, everyone. Speak soon.